children's literature. Juvenile literature includes stories, books, magazines, and poems that are enjoyed by children. Modern children's literature is classified in two different ways. Genre: the intended age of the reader. Children's literature can be traced to stories and songs, part of a wider oral tradition that adults shared with children before publishing existed. The development of early children's literature, before printing was invented, is difficult to trace. Even after printing became widespread, many classic children's tales were originally created for adults and later adapted for a younger audience. Since the 15th century, a large quantity of literature, often with a moral or religious message, has been aimed specifically at children. The late 19th and early 20th centuries became known as the Golden Age of children's literature, as this period included the publication of many books acknowledged today as classics. Introduction. There is no single or widely used definition of children's literature. It can be broadly defined as anything that children read, or more specifically defined as fiction, non-fiction, poetry, or drama intended for and used by children and young people. Nancy Anderson, of the College of Education at the University of South Florida, defines children's literature as all books written for children, excluding works such as comic books, joke books, cartoon books, and non-fiction works that are not intended to be read from front to back, such as dictionaries, encyclopedias, and other reference materials. The International Companion Encyclopedia of Children's Literature notes that the boundaries of genre are not fixed but blurred. Sometimes no agreement can be reached about whether a given work is best categorized as literature for adults or children. Some works defy easy categorization. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series was written and marketed for young adults, but it is also popular among adults. The series' extreme popularity led the New York Times to create a separate bestseller list for children's books. Despite the widespread association of children's literature with picture books, spoken narratives existed before printing, and the root of many children's tales go back to ancient storytellers. Seth Lira, in the opening of children's literature, A Reader's History from Aesop to Harry Potter, says, "This book presents a history of what children have heard and read. The history I write of is a history of reception." History. Early children's literature consisted of spoken stories, songs, and poems that were used to educate, instruct, and entertain children. It was only in the 18th century, with the development of the concept of childhood, that a separate genre of children's literature began to emerge, with its own divisions, expectations, and canon. French historian Philippe Aries argues in his 1962 book Centuries of Childhood that the modern concept of childhood only emerged in recent times. He explains that children were in the past not considered as greatly different from adults and were not given significantly different treatment. As evidence for this position, he notes that, apart from instructional and didactic texts for children written by clerics like the Venerable Bede and Alfred Vensham, there was a lack of any genuine literature aimed specifically at children before the 18th century. Other scholars have qualified this viewpoint by noting that there was a literature designed to convey the values, attitudes, and information necessary for children within their cultures, such as the play of Daniel from the 12th century. Pre-modern children's literature, therefore, tended to be of a didactic and moralistic nature, with the purpose of conveying conduct-related, educational and religious lessons. Early modern Europe. During the 17th century, the concept of childhood began to emerge in Europe. Adults saw children as separate beings, innocent and in need of protection and training by the adults around them. The English philosopher John Locke developed his theory of the tabula rasa in his 1690 an essay concerning human understanding. In Locke's philosophy, tabula rasa was the theory that the mind is at birth a blank slate without rules for processing data, and that data is added and rules for processing are formed solely by one's sensory experiences. A corollary of this doctrine was that the mind of the child was born blank, and that it was the duty of the parents to imbue the child with correct notions. Locke himself emphasized the importance of providing children with easy, pleasant books to develop the minds rather than using force to compel them. Children may be cozened into a knowledge of the letters, be taught to read, without perceiving it to be anything but a sport, and play themselves into that which others are whipped for. Quote, he also suggested that picture books be created for children. Another influence on this shift in attitudes came from Puritanism, which stressed the importance of individual salvation. Puritans were concerned with the spiritual welfare of their children, and there was a large growth in the publication of good godly books aimed squarely at children. Some of the most popular works were by James Janeway, but the most enduring book from this movement, still widely read today, was The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Chapbooks, pocket-sized pamphlets that were often folded instead of being stitched, were published in Britain, illustrated by woodblock printing. These inexpensive booklets reprinted popular ballads, historical retellings, and folk tales. Though not specifically published for children at this time, young people enjoyed the booklets as well. Johanna Bradley says, in From Chapbooks to Plum Cake, the chapbooks kept imaginative stories from being lost to readers under the strict Puritan influence of the time. Horn books also appeared in England during this time, teaching children basic information such as the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer. These were brought from England to the American colonies in the mid-17th century. The first such book was a catechism for children written in verse by the Puritan John Cotton, known as Spiritual Milk for Boston Babes. It was published in 1646, appearing both in England and Boston. Another early book, the New England Primer, was in print by 1691 and used in schools for 100 years. The primer begins, "In Adam's fall we sinned all," and continues through the alphabet. It also contained religious maxims, acronyms, spelling help and other educational items, all decorated by woodcuts. In 1634, the Pentamerone from Italy became the first major published collection of European folk tales. Charles Perrault began recording fairy tales in France, publishing his first collection in 1697. They were not well received among the French literary society, who saw them as only fit for old people and children. In 1658, Jan Amos Comenius in Bohemia published the informative illustrated Orbis Pictus for children under 6 learning to read. It is considered to be the first picture book produced specifically for children. The first Danish children's book was The Child's Mirror by Niels Bredel in 1568, an adaptation of a courtesy book by the Dutch priest Erasmus. A Pretty and Splendid Maiden's Mirror, an adaptation of a German book for young women, became the first Swedish children's book upon its 1591 publication. Sweden published Fables and a children's magazine by 1766. In Italy, Giovanni Francesco Straparola released The Facetious Knights of Straparola in the 1550s, called the first European story book to contain fairy tales. It eventually had 75 separate stories and written for an adult audience. Giulio Cesare Croce also borrowed from stories children enjoyed for his books. Russia's earliest children's books, primers, appeared in the late 16th century. An early example is ABC Book, an alphabet book published by Ivan Fyodorov in 1571. the first picture book published in Russia. Karian Nisterman's The Illustrated Primer appeared in 1694. Peter the Great's interest in modernizing his country through westernization helped Western children's literature dominate the field through the 18th century. Catherine the Great wrote allegories for children, and during her reign, Nikolai Novikov started the first juvenile magazine in Russia. Origins of the modern genre. The modern children's book emerged in mid-18th century England. A growing polite middle class and the influence of Lockean theories of childhood innocence combined to create the beginnings of childhood as a concept. A Little Pretty Pocket Book, written and published by John Newbery, is widely considered the first modern children's book, published in 1744. It was a landmark as the first children's publication aimed at giving enjoyment to children, containing a mixture of rhymes, picture stories and games for pleasure. Newbery believed that play was a better enticement to children's good behavior than physical discipline, and the child was to record his or her behavior daily. The book was child-sized with a brightly colored cover that appealed to children, something new in the publishing industry. Known as gift books, these early books became the precursors to the toy books popular in the 19th century. Newbery was also adept at marketing this new genre. According to the journal The Lion and the Unicorn, Newbery's genius was in developing the fairly new product category, children's books, through his frequent advertisements, and his clever ploy of introducing additional titles and products into the body of his children's books. The improvement in the quality of books for children, as well as the diversity of topics he published, helped make Newbery the leading producer of children's books in his time. He published his own books as well as those by authors such as Samuel Johnson and Oliver Goldsmith. The latter may have written the history of Little Goody Two-Shoes, Newbery's most popular book. Another philosopher who influenced the development of children's literature was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued that children should be allowed to develop naturally and joyously. His idea of appealing to a children's natural interests took hold among writers for children. Popular examples included Thomas Day's The History of Sandford and Merton, 4 volumes that embody Rousseau's theories. Furthermore, Maria and Richard Lovell Edgeworth's Practical Education, The History of Harry and Lucy, urged children to teach themselves. Rousseau's ideas also had great influence in Germany, especially on German philanthropism, a movement concerned with reforming both education and literature for children. Its founder, Johann Bernhard Basedow, authored Elemental Work as a popular textbook for children that included many illustrations by Daniel Chodowiecki. Another follower, Joachim Heinrich Camp, created an adaptation of Robinson Crusoe that went into over 100 printings. He became Germany's outstanding and most modern writer for children, according to Hans Heino Ewers in the International Companion Encyclopedia of Children's Literature. It can be argued that from this time, the history of European children's literature was largely written in Germany. Quote, in the early 19th century, Danish author and poet Hans Christian Andersen traveled through Europe and gathered many well-known fairy tales. He was followed by the Brothers Grimm, who preserved the traditional tales told in Germany. They were so popular in the home country that modern, realistic children's literature began to be looked down on there. This dislike of non-traditional stories continued there until the beginning of the next century. The Grimms' contribution to children's literature goes beyond the collection of stories, as great as that is. As professors, they had a scholarly interest in the stories, striving to preserve them and the variations accurately, recording the sources. A similar project was carried out by the Norwegian scholars Peter Christian Asbjørnsen and Jørgen Moe. Mo, who collected Norwegian fairy tales and published them as Norwegian folk tales, often referred to as Asbjørnsen and Mo. By compiling these stories, they preserved Norway's literary heritage and helped create the Norwegian written language. In Switzerland, Johann David Wyss published The Swiss Family Robinson in 1812, with the aim of teaching children about family values, good husbandry, the uses of the natural world and self-reliance. The book became popular across Europe after it was translated into French by Isabelle de Montaigu. E.T.A. Hoffmann's tale, The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, was published in 1816 in a German collection of stories for children, Kindermärchen. It is the first modern short story to introduce bizarre, odd and grotesque elements in children's literature and thereby anticipates Lewis Carroll's tale, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. There are not only parallels concerning the content, but also the origin of the tales, as both are dedicated and given to a daughter of the author's friends. Golden Age. The shift to a modern genre of children's literature occurred in the mid-19th century, as the didacticism of a previous age began to make way for more humorous, child-oriented books, more attuned to the child's imagination. The availability of children's literature greatly increased as well, as paper and printing became widely available and affordable. The population grew and literacy rates improved. Tom Brown's School Days by Thomas Hughes appeared in 1857, and is considered to be the founding book in the school story tradition. However, it was Lewis Carroll's fantasy, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published in 1865 in England, that signaled the change in writing style for children to an imaginative and empathetic one. Regarded as the first English masterpiece written for children and as a founding book in the development of fantasy literature, its publication opened the first golden age of children's literature in Britain and Europe that continued until the early 1900s. Another important book of that decade was The Water Babies, a fairy tale for a land baby, by Reverend Charles Kingsley, which became extremely popular in England and remains a classic of British children's literature. In 1883, Carlo Collodi read the first Italian fantasy novel, The Adventures of Pinocchio, which was translated many times. In that same year, Emilio Salgari, the man who would become the adventure writer par excellence for the young in Italy, gave birth to his most legendary character Sandokan. In Britain, The Princess and the Goblin and its sequel The Princess and Curdie, by George MacDonald, appeared in 1872 and 1883, and the adventure stories Treasure Island and Kidnapped, both by Robert Louis Stevenson, were extremely popular in the 1880s. Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book was first published in 1894, and J. M. Barrie told the story of Peter Pan in the novel Peter and Wendy in 1911. Johanna Spyri's two-part novel Heidi was published in Switzerland in 1880 and 1881. In the U.S., children's publishing entered a period of growth after the American Civil War in 1865. Boys' book writer Oliver Optic published over 100 books. In 1868, the epoch-making book, Little Women, the fictionalized autobiography of Louisa May Alcott, was published. This coming-of-age story established the genre of realistic family books in the United States. Mark Twain released Tom Sawyer in 1876, and in 1880 another bestseller, Uncle Remus, His Songs and His Sayings, a collection of African-American folk tales adapted and compiled by Joel Chandler Harris, appeared.